Hey everyone, welcome to another That's Initiative. We're on episode 3 now, so we're chugging along nicely. Um, Joining me as always, we have Greg. So, hi Greg.
Hi, Kris.
Yeah. We do keep getting requests. Oh, if you need a third person, I'm up for coming on. But I think the format works pretty well with just the two of us. It keeps the discussion relatively concise, especially with the topics we've been hitting. I think they do fit a two-person forum more than an open table discussion. I don't know. I think we'd be doing like 3 hour episodes if we had any more people.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I waffle on about X-Wing for like 3 hour shows. I like having this one as keeping it at 60 minutes, so I'm happy. Speaking about it not being too meandering, but we do have a giveaway this week. So I've done like prep work, so I can transition now. So anyone watching on YouTube can see a nice grizzly bear. I wanted to test out the Games Workshop contrast paints on the like the deep cut models because they come like pre-primed. So I threw some contrast on it without doing anything, and then did some detail work. So we have a grizzly bear to give away. Whoever wins can either pick the painted one, or I do have one still sealed in the box if someone would rather paint their own, or if they just don't want to use painting minis, that's all right as well. I don't judge. Greg, I don't judge if you want to use some painted miniatures. It's fine.
Sure. I'll just drop off all my miniatures. You can start working on case one, and when you get near the end, you just let me know.
So what I'm going to do, because I'm a horrible person, I'm going to ask a question at some random point in the video, and then we'll find the answer at a different random point in the video, and then you've got to watch it all. See, if you want to win a free grizzly bear that's painted or not, anywhere in the world we'll ship to. We'll cover shipping and everything, but you have to watch it all. And yeah, so there we go. Keep watching and you'll be fine. If you want that grizzly bear, stay tuned. Coming soon, I promise. It's only an hour. You've got you've watched more garbage than this in that amount of time. You know you have. But okay, we'll get on to the main topic. So it's a good segue. You see, that was like a subplot for this episode, and then we can go back to like the meta plot and what this episode's really about, and you dip in and out of the subplot. See how it all ties together.
See, so
It,
this isn't about Fireball.
no, it's not about Fireball. I was a little bit worried because I put the poll up, and within like 5 minutes, Fireball had roared ahead with like 100% of the votes. People really wanted to listen to your rant, and then I think the general public got hold of it, and um, the interest in an actual topic kind of picked up. So we're going to put that one on a back burner because I think I may have undersold it as more of a rant than an actual discussion. So we'll keep that one on a back burner because I know you've done a decent amount of prep work for that topic. So we'll maybe do that one in a couple of weeks.
Perfect.
Yeah, but we are going to talk about the meta plot. So
What's that, Kris?
exactly the meta plot of a meta storyline. So, yeah, I have a notepad which you haven't seen with my show notes, and point one is what is a meta story or plot? So, well done. So for me, when I think about the meta story of a campaign for any role playing game, it's the story that I'm trying to tell as a GM or a DM. What's happening in the world, the overall reason the characters are going to be taking part in the adventures, and I don't know. Is that how you think of it, or do you have a different opinion?
Yeah, I think uh, it is the arc of your
Yeah,
story. Yeah, the sort of it is the story that will unfold. Yeah, over the course of your campaign.
yeah. With or without the characters' participation.
Yeah, for sometimes. Sometimes. I mean, I think that there's uh, an interesting thought to it in that you plan your sessions, and then when the players seem least interested in interacting with what you've prepared, you spring the meta story on them.
Yeah.
When they're like least prepared. That's always the best. That's the best time.
Okay. So I've got an as a next question on this from a general perspective of it. Uh, is it important to have a meta plot when you start, or why is the meta plot important? There's kind of like two questions in there.
Well, that's kind of like what I just mentioned in that it can be used to introduce when your sort of session based storyline either lags out or the players are seem to be at an impasse. That's always a good point to enter something else that to occupy their time.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to touch on before we get too deep into looking at it from the game master perspective first. I wanted to touch on like the difference between a sandbox game and like a railroady train tracks kind of thing. That's one of the fears I think people can have when they get too deep into a meta story. That if you're trying to hammer away at it, it can feel a little bit forced sometimes. So how do you go about incorporating a sandbox game over top of the storyline? Or do you just let those train tracks run and then let the characters jump on and off the train? Or
I think that's less of an issue with the meta, uh, that it's going to be linear because I think, like, even with this campaign we're currently playing in, I had an idea, but I don't need to really expand upon it until I get to the point where I'm going to potentially include it. So it gives me a lot of time to think about what I want to do with it, where I want to go with it. And interestingly enough, while I was watching YouTube today, and it's happened in the past, the masterwork classes that you always see in ads when you're watching it on your phone.
yeah,
Well, so I saw the Dan Brown intro, and he's the guy who wrote Da Vinci Code
yeah,
and that. He was like, if you want to introduce an interesting story, make an interesting villain for your readers, in his case,
yeah,
right? To because he's like, college professor is not an interesting character, but he is when he is confronted by, villain X. So I thought, hey, well, that's kind of interesting, right? That
yeah,
maybe not the way I'd always considered it, but certainly I think that's the driving force in any meta story is the force. It doesn't necessarily be an individual; it could be a group, it could be anything that is pushing their agenda in the background.
yeah. Okay, so I think that kind of transitions us pretty well onto covering it. The what we usually do is obviously talk about general points first, then either the player or game master perspective, and then the other one that we didn't first touch on. So
Yeah,
I thought the better way to come at this one was come at it from the game master perspective first, and go from there. So I think you made some good points, which are mainly for the game master already in that. So I'll throw a couple of my thoughts in, then we can back and forth on it.
sure.
I know, for me, if I'm gonna game master a campaign, uh, I spend most of my time that isn't just world building, and especially because a lot of the stuff I like to run, like if I'm running Warhammer, I know the world pretty in depth anyway. If I'm running a 40k or something like that, I know enough that I can probably blag different planets and hive worlds and death worlds and that kind of thing. So I don't worry too much about the world building because I don't know where the characters are going to want to go. I kind of build that session by session. I spend all of my time trying to lay out the overall bits of story that I want them to interact with. What could they interact with? But we're going to struggle to see. They'd have to really get into the big plot at a pace to see these parts happening.
Right.
If they stop it here, they've already won, but they don't know yet. Type thing. And I always like to have a slow growing villain and different threats and things like that. So I think a good example would be the Warhammer game that you were playing in that I ran, where we started off running the intro scenario of a rulebook, and
Right.
that takes place in Grimhagen, I think it was.
Yeah, I think
or
so.
Borgenhafen, Grimhagen. I think it was Grimhagen. Um, so you start off in this basically this little nothing village where it's just a plot device to get you started. You leave there, you go to Middenheim, and then you get the Ashes of Middenheim book, and then you can go to Altdorf and play the Spires of Altdorf, and then the Forges of Nuln, and that's the campaign done. But I wanted it to feel more like a sandboxy world, and we were just doing this story arc as the old computer game RPG exclamation mark above some of the character's head.
Oh, right.
This
Yeah,
this is your quest if you want to do it.
that's
At
right.
any point, you can leave this alone and go and do something else. But because we started in Grimhagen, I wanted to get some hooks back into there. So obviously, the choices you guys made, we ended up. You read in the newspaper that everyone in Grimhagen died of a plague, and that threat was going to keep building, and it's a Nurgle invasion coming down from the remnants of the war, and there was going to be a big uprising there, and then some Skaven, and they would be like vying for the clan pestilence versus the Nurgle for who was going to be in control of these artifacts. And that was going to go on whether you guys like it was happening and you had no idea until I've just told you now that
Sure, we
it
were eventually going to interact with it. Otherwise, it would have been a meta story that existed only in your head.
yeah. And I was happy for that to happen because I had multiple different meta stories. Like uh, I had like multiple hooks. The world was always like ultimately, if I'm playing a Warhammer game now, the world is always going to end because we now have Age of Sigmar, so it has to. You know,
Right.
the characters are just postponing the inevitable, as it were. But when I've done stuff for other games, like if I was planning a D&D campaign, I do think what you said was a really key point in nailing down the characters of your villains. And it doesn't have to be the giant, world destroying villains. It can be the level 5 necromancer who lives in a tower outside the village. Can be the first character you really try and get to grips with.
No,
Who
absolutely. I
it can
think you want to, even then, it's incremental. So
yeah.
you pick that force which is going to be running in the background for that particular period of your campaign, and when the players eventually overcome it or ignore it, um, it you tie it into the sort of next tier where you find out that the level 5 necromancer guy was just working as an agent on behalf of some other person,
Yeah.
right? And then it just sort of grows of its own accord. um, yeah, and I think that that works well. Like I don't really you want to be efficient as a game master in the amount of time you spend working on the meta story, because the players are going to have the least interaction with it until it becomes the sort of primary story,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, until it's escalated to the point where the players have decided that they choose to interact with it, or uh, you know it's on its terminal course, and then which place it supplants the main story, right? And it becomes the main story. So
Yeah. I think we've kind of touched on one of the pitfalls I think game masters fall into is that because you're really excited about your meta story, that you want to tell it and you want to force it upon your players, and that rolls back into what I mentioned earlier about the sandbox versus the train tracks. I feel like if you keep hammering it home to the players, that no one's going to enjoy the game because you're telling your story and they're just watching it happen. I think that's really important that you've got to really consider the pacing of it and like be pretty loose with your meta story. I don't think you want to nail it down too
no,
early in the campaign. Uh, like I said, I had different plot hooks for the Warhammer one. If you'd spoken about going to Marienburg and sailing off to go and see the lizard men, so
I want to be a
okay,
pirate.
yeah,
Be an
that's
elven pirate. Yeah.
yeah, that's fine. We can do that. I can come up with some meta story around there. But obviously, if I'm really invested in this Nurgle invasion coming out of Grimhagen, and you all go the opposite direction and sail to Ulfweir, I'm pretty screwed if that's like I keep saying, oh, you're hearing about all this stuff going on in Grimhagen, and you're like, how we don't get carrier pigeons on this boat.
I mean,
Oh,
that's the inherent danger of the sandbox. I mean, by pure definition, you create the exterior, so
yeah,
your world or whatever part of the portion of your world that the players are exposed to, you have a rough idea of what exists within it, and you plunk the players down somewhere,
yeah.
and then you step away, and the decision making is in their hands as far as like what they're going to do, right? So I don't know that the meta story, like the meta story is just it is a tool, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it matters what type of game you're running. I don't think so. I don't know. What do you feel like? Do you think it matters if you're running a sandbox game or some other type of game?
No, and I was going to come on to rolling back to what we spoke about in the general points of like, why is it important or is it important? I think that if you've got the right group who are interacting with your world in the right way, you can play a game never touching a meta story at all. You
Or
can let,
or they or them even better is when they do, but they don't realize,
yeah,
right? Where they just assume that, oh, well, that these series of events that occurred to them are totally unrelated until they realize that they weren't, that they are indeed related, and then that revelation is the like slow burn that you've been working for.
well, I suppose what I'm getting at is like where you explore the characters' stories rather than them exploring yours can be a really interesting game as well.
Oh,
Where
for sure, for sure.
the meta story becomes the characters' stories, and it was never like you didn't go into a campaign intending for this to be the story. But I think a good example would be if I was running a game of D&D for you guys, and then like um we'll stick with Warhammer one. I think that's pretty solid on where I'm going. But where the meta story was going on, and it wasn't really relevant to what you folks were doing because the story was slowly becoming about Davina's character and her exploration of her own abilities and the trouble that was going to cause, and all the other stuff was still happening. Ultimately, I'm not going to blow the world up in the middle of this other story. So that just gets a big pause button pushed,
Sure.
and we could play the campaign. The characters could get to like the fifth or sixth career level 20 D&D characters, and like have children, grow old, and the meta story never comes back because
So
the it's interesting playing the character stories, and that becomes you just shelve it, use that for a different campaign, and go
yeah,
with the other
so that
story.
begs whether that is indeed a meta story or just part of your setting detail,
Yeah,
right? So I think if we're talking about like the sort of classic meta, I think is something that is inevitably interacting with the players, regardless of what they do,
hmm.
right? That they don't they're not aware of its existence at the
Yeah,
beginning, and it slowly reveals itself, um, and that's why it doesn't really matter. You have like an idea of what you want to do. You
yeah,
don't need to have specifics, and you insert it at the point you pick, right, to reveal it, and it becomes seamless so that the players just assume that, hey, we went and rescued the girl in the dress shop, and then, we went here, and then we had this interaction with this girl in the forest, and then we took her back to her town. And so is the girl in the forest the meta story? Is the getting to the town the meta story? Was the dressmaker girl like you don't know until you start to piece it together,
yeah,
right? And then the players are all like, whoa, and that's the reaction you're looking for because the whole idea that you've got two, not parallel, but you have a story running that encompasses every session that you're in. Sometimes, like you said, there's very little interaction between the players, just because whatever they're doing is preoccupying their time. If like in this particular one, this particular week session, you guys are exploring the sewers, then I don't feel the need, if this whole session is you guys running around in the sewers, for me to like interject something just for the sake of, so to remind you that there's something going on in the background, right? I
Yeah.
don't feel like that's necessary. And so, yeah, like I th- I think it is more prevalent in a sandbox game because the sandbox, you have no control over the player's actions, but the meta story is your control factor in sort of the big picture of things, right? So where no matter where they go or what they do, they interact with an episode within your meta story,
Yeah.
right?
So I'm just going to take a minute 'cause we're going to ask a question for a prize now, just so that
Okay.
people can know. So, what are we running around this week? We're going to run around the sewers, you said, this week. So
Yeah.
there you go. So, what are we going to run around this week, folks? That's going to be a question. I have to keep listening to find out where you send the answer to.
Oh, what city or town the players are actually in?
Oh, we can go out, yeah. So, what sewers are we going to be running around in? And then Greg will give us the answer later on.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll have
So
to
there
look
we go.
that up. I'll have to look that up.
I know it. I've got your map pack saved in my head. Okay. So, anything you wanted to cover more from a game master perspective before we go on to a player perspective of a meta story?
Just that I feel like it gives a sense that there's more to your world than just what the players are experiencing.
Yeah.
That's I think key. It gives this sort of expanded reality that the players' actions have relevance, that the choices they make, um, are it can affect the things that are going on outside of stuff that they're aware of, right? I think that's the whole point behind it.
Yeah.
That, and like I said, this whole uh, if all you're doing is making your game like watching a season of Star Trek, where every week you have an episode. They're not
Yeah.
they're not necessarily related. Lots of
Yeah.
them are just like a creature feature or something else, and
Yeah.
like whatever. And you want to tie your game together, right? You
I
you
think
want
that's a really good example, actually, using Star Trek. I think you can tell a lot of different style of stories depending on what style of Star Trek, and different people have favorite treks.
right,
And like, I love DS9 because it's really, once you get into like the Dominion stuff, the meta story is really tight and flows through the rest of the series and of the rest of the seasons, I should say.
sure,
You still get the episodes where there's individual quests going on, like Odo and Quark get stuck on a mountain and have to climb up and send a transmitter, and
yeah,
that doesn't really affect the meta story at all. But the Dominion War is happening all the way through that, and I think that's a really good way of looking at it, where you've got obviously like the original series, the meta stories, the continuing the 3 year mission.
the abbreviated mission.
Yeah,
Yeah, there is no meta story in classic Trek,
yeah.
right? It's just uh,
But some people prefer classic Trek. So
right. No, for sure. I think the one that sticks out in my mind, and I mean Star Trek DS9 is excellent for that, is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So that, in a season of 20 episodes of Buffy, you would have a dozen that were the pushing the storyline for the season along. You would have a couple that were just random creature features where just, some monsters just show up for no particular reason, right? And then there's there's like sort of character driven lines where maybe one or two episodes about this character and that character, this character and that character, and stuff like that. And then, they just use the meta story to tie it all together.
Yeah.
And so you end up with somewhere in the first couple episodes, this sort of conflict occurs, and then you watch it develop over the course of 20 episodes, and then you get resolution at the end of the season.
Unless you're watching Battlestar Galactica and then you finish the entire series with no resolution.
Sure. Sure. I guess so. I don't know. So even within that, I think within season by season, you're still I don't know, like unless you're talking about them like looking for Earth as the meta, but even within each season, there's a big
I want
overarching story.
Starbuck and Apollo to get together. Leave me alone. I want them to live a happy life together. Don't ruin it for me.
Well, yeah, that was never going to happen.
No resolution. Okay. So what I wanted to actually touch on before, because it rolls into my couple of points I wanted to bring up from a player perspective, is one of the pitfalls of, like we said, about forcing the story upon the players. I think you've got to be really careful when you introduce the initial parts of a meta story, where you're like the threads where you're trying to tie it together. If your players are really, really invested in visiting this traveling carnival or going to the pet shop, that's probably the wrong time to drop some knowledge bombs that are going to be really important later on in your story. So
Perhaps.
yeah, I don't.
I guess it all depends, right? If you can find a way to weave that session into your meta plot, right? Turns out that the shopkeeper that owned the pet store, right, works for some person who does something else, who's, and lots of that is retconning,
Yeah,
right? Where you just sort of sprinkle a little bit of information when they're wherever it is that they're at the pet store, let's say. So they're at the pet store, and the interaction they have between the NPC and the players. Uh, he talks about stuff, and the players are all like, that is really kind of irrelevant to us. We don't really know that. He's talking about something, and the players are like, why is he talking about this? And then like later on, you're like, oh, weren't we in this pet store in this town? And the guy said something about that. And then they like rifle through their notes. And then sure enough, right, they're like, oh, wow, maybe we ought to pay attention to what the NPCs say more often. So
blessed with it.
maybe Ribbles is the grand archmeister in the meta plot. And you get a plot of the gnomes to take over the world.
Yeah. But see, there you're relying on having players who take notes. But there we go. Okay, so I think we'll move on and look at like the meta story from a player perspective now. And when you're playing a game, what do you go into it? Like, I suppose there's different ways of starting campaigns. Would probably be the best way to approach it. When you're picking what campaign you're gonna play in, do you like choose which meta you like, or do you just pick a character and throw it into whatever story's going to be coming?
From the player.
Yeah,
Yeah, for
I
me,
think so.
I don't. I prefer I don't know. Well, if it's done right, I don't think the player even knows that they're being exposed to the second story. I think
I,
if it's done correctly.
I suppose I remember uh, I can't think of words now. The Matt Colville, when he was talking about starting up doing the stream, and he like had these different like 3 or 4 different settings for his players to play
Yeah,
in.
yeah.
So like
This campaign proposition or
yeah,
whatever, right?
yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
So do you like try and dig deep into to that proposition to try and figure out, oh, if a meta story is going to be about this, I want my character to fit in, or do you let the DM worry about how much do you buy into a meta story before you've even started playing type thing?
I don't think. Well, for me, I don't
Yeah,
think it matters.
no, for you,
I don't think it matters personally. But I'm my perspective on things. I don't. We talk this leads back to last week's episode where we talked about party composition. I don't think it really matters what you're playing, right? Because you're reacting to the information you're gathering,
yeah.
and the direction you come at it will be determined by the character that you're playing.
So on the flip side of that, how much of an obligation do you feel as the player to actually participate in the DM story once it starts becoming apparent?
Well, that's the secret, isn't it? So if your game master has done it poorly, you have no personal connection to the story.
Yeah.
If your DM has done it well, you're already invested in it, right? It's not a choice because something that's relevant or important to your character is what's driving it. And so it's very seamless. You just move into it, right? You might not even see that boundary where he, switches from camera one to camera two.
Yeah.
You're just moving along, and you're now in the meta. You're now in the sort of big story, and you don't even realize it.
Yeah.
So it's really up. That's on the game master. The players, yeah, they can be like the halfling who doesn't want to go on adventures, right? Where they fight everything the game master tries to do, right? But ultimately, the game master. I think the more you force your players, the more resistant they become, right? So if you're sort of like, well, you guys have to go here, right? Whereas like when we were starting out, and I asked you guys, and I don't know what you can determine how you felt about it as a player, but I said, just for preparation's sake, which direction are you guys going to go? Are you
Yeah.
guys going to go this way along the coast? Or are you going to go this way up, along the forest? And
Yeah.
you said, oh, we're going to go this way up along the forest. And I mean, that's where I left it. I didn't feel like I was forcing your hand. The option was there for you to choose. Um, but the choice you make would have influenced the preparation that I would have done.
Yeah. I suppose part of it as well is not just thinking of it from like our sense. I think if I'm running a game for you, or vice versa, if I have no interest in taking part in your meta plot at the moment, I know that we're gonna be okay if I just ignore it for a few weeks and carry on doing what I was doing. Or if the story's going in a different way, it's not gonna ruin your experience as a game master. But I feel like not everyone's gonna be like that. So I think from my perspective or from my opinion, I think as a player, you should probably give your DM a little bit of leeway for if they've been ham-fisted with the meta story. Roll with it a little bit, give it a couple of sessions. If it's garbage, that can become somebody else's problem and you can move on. But I would advise against being overly resistant unless your GM's bought into the halfling who doesn't want to go on adventures. Because I think nothing's going to destroy your game and stop someone wanting to GM for you quicker than the person who just wants to stay at home eating their cheese and drinking their wine in Hobbiton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, like so. I mean, that was a sort of that.
So I'll let you tell the story because I think it's a pretty amusing story,
Right.
and the way it turns out and how it was dealt with, I think, is pretty good. But it's also a cautionary tale, shall we say?
So just like you talked about Matt Colville, except this was the player came with a proposition to me as the game master. I want to make a character. He wants to just be a regular halfling. He has like a hobbit hole and he lives a pretty regular life. And I was like, okay, I'm not really sure where you're going with this, but let's see. And he's like, so I want the onus to be on you to put me in a situation where I have to do things that are going to lead to the unraveling of some stories. And I was like, oh, well, I said, that is not the most, that is not something that I'd ever considered. That's a pretty unusual request and a pretty, um, that's not something as a game master, that's not how you would think your sessions are going to go. But I'm like, okay, well, it was just a one on one, like it was just the two of us playing. So sure enough. So he made this little halfling guy. I don't remember what class he was because it was really irrelevant. He was like a halfling like baker or something for all I know. Um, and so, when his pantry ran out or when he ran out of beer, he had to go to the neighboring town to see the brewery to get more stuff. And when he was traveling along the road, the wheel on his wagon broke, and he was trying to repair his wagon, and then he got attacked by goblins, and they ran off with his like ham that he had in the back of the thing, and he decided to chase after them. And so, I mean, this just sort of like unfolded, and then we tried to make it so that at the end of every session, he ended up back at his house,
Yeah.
right? So, however long we decided we were going to play. And so it forced me to be creative, to come up. And there was lots of times, I'd be like, when it was maybe too predictable on my part, right? Where I would be like, oh, well, you ran out of this because you need to go here. He's like, well, if I was short on it, the last time when I went to that town, like 2 weeks ago, when I went to pick up whatever else it was that I was short of, I would have picked it up too. And I was like, okay, that's probably a pretty fair. That's pretty, because I did tell you that I made a list of all the things I was running out of because I am actively trying to not go on adventures because they're terrible and they make you late for lunch, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, that's a fair point. And so, it was the onus was on me to come up with solutions that were viable. And I won't say he fought it, but if it was reasonable, he went with it. If
Yeah.
it was unreasonable, he called me out on it,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, and like
And that's the line right there that you said is if it was reasonable, and obviously that was the premise of the entire game. So calling you out on your half-ass attempt to make him leave his house,
sure,
it is fine. But once you've got a good reason, it's like, well, so as an example, I'm pretty sure that none of this did happen. But like, if you build up the fact that there's a hornet's nest being developed in his garden, and he comes back from one of his not wanting to be in adventures, and it's a fully fledged hornet's nest, and he's like, "Oh well, that scroll I got that was message. I'm just going to send a message to some exterminator, and they can come and deal with that."
yeah.
And I'm just going to hire. I've got gold from that last adventure, so I'm just going to pay someone to go and deal with that. And every session turns into him just hiring someone to do a job for him because
Well,
he just
until something bad happens, so he
yeah
hires the neighbor kid to come and knock the hornet's nest out of the tree, and then the kid messes it up and gets stung, and now they have to take him to see the doctor.
yeah. But like I
Right?
said,
So I
but
mean, yeah, like that is the game master adjusting, right? And the player at that point, as much as he may have fought it, right? It's like, he's trying to be a smartass
yeah,
and be
and
like,
that that's
I'm gonna defeat your whole sending me on an adventure thing. Well, the game master just sort of like just keeps turning the story until he finds the right orientation to move ahead.
yeah
It's not always linear in that like A goes to B goes to C. Sometimes you have to, you have what you had in mind, and uh you prep something, and the players, well,
and
like
that,
it's the
and
other story, right?
you,
Where they're,
you prep something and leave a corridor all along one side, and the players just walk past your encounter
yeah, okay, let's not go there. But so
again.
we were playing in Temple of Elemental Evil, and that in a relevant NPC. So an NPC that the players were very well connected. He was sort of their buddy, right? He was a lot of their source of information. He was the first guy they met and all that stuff. He got kidnapped, right? And the signs were pretty obvious the direction that he went. And so I had prepped this encounter with the force that had taken him in the forest. I mean, we might have talked about this in previous episodes, but so the players sort of just outthought me, and they were like, we could chase him anywhere in the forest, but we ultimately know where they're going. They're going to the temple at the next town. So let's go to the next town and wait for them outside the temple, and we'll ambush them when they get there. So rather than us chase them around in the forest, and yes, that meant that encounter that I planned, that was a cautionary lesson for me because like I pre-plotted all this stuff, and it just was for naught, right? Then the players sort of, and good on them, right? Like, I mean, I didn't see it coming, um, but it was definitely a much and you could see their logic as they were talking about it. We could wander anywhere in the forest, right? For all we know, that they could split up into two groups, and we don't know which group has got the NPC, and we could just get lost in the forest, and then we could end up getting ambushed, and yeah, and so you're just like, okay, well, like, I just sat there and watched them, and while that's going on, I'm taking the opportunity to like make a plan because that's I'm going to have to improvise something when they just come to the conclusion. So I sort of get an idea of what they're thinking of doing, and then I start sketching out a plan so that it's not like, uh, well, we have to stop here because I have nothing planned,
Yeah,
right? Yeah. So I mean, you're and well, I think it might have the what I had planned out would have been more detailed. Ultimately, they enjoyed the session more because they felt like they'd won before we even got to the encounter, right?
yeah,
Because they were all set up, ready for the ambush. And their ambush, I mean, it would have been unfair of me to intentionally make their ambush fail.
yeah,
They went through all the precautions and set up their hiding spots and all this stuff. And sure enough, these orcs came trucking down the path with their dude, and they were headed to the entrance of the temple. And the players just sprung out and obliterated them,
yeah,
right? And as we've talked about, as the game master, when your players walk away from the table cheering, you've won.
yeah,
As the players ultimately, and that was all on them. There was very little in that session that I did to make it an amazing session. That was mostly on them, but my job there was to not screw up their victory, right? When they had come up with a reasonable proposition and they planned it all out and all this stuff, the last thing I want to do is go and sabotage it because I feel like they're beating my scenario,
yeah,
right? Yeah. So yeah, so I think that while we're getting away from the whole meta story thing, I think that those are all invaluable, and that goes to whatever story you're telling,
yeah.
right?
Well, I think one of the things I was going to bring it on to from that talking point of your one-on-one game as a halfling, and then that example you just gave there, I think the keys to those like adversarial plays. We spoke about adversarial DMs in the party composition one. I think the meta story is a very good time to talk about an adversarial player. I think I would really want to know my DM pretty well. Not necessarily having to be like best friends or anything like that, but I wouldn't want to be an adversarial player to a DM in the first ever game I play with them.
So the adversarial player, in my experience, having DM'd quite a bit,
And so
well,
I want to clarify, I'm not talking about a Wang Rod player who's being a dick to like the other players and stuff like. Like the person who's calling you out all the time on your scenario not making sense and not
sure,
in a
but they're doing that so that they can showboat in front of the other players.
yeah. Well,
So, while they may not meet the definition of the Wang Rod, they're
they're a Wang Rod to a DM, maybe not to the other players. The
well,
other
they
players might
they
think they're
are
awesomely
because
smart.
because ultimately they're undermining the story,
Yeah,
right? For no particular reason. Like you know what, when what you've planned is when your lack of preparation shows, then you deserve to get called out. And it's bad for everybody. It's bad for you. It's bad for your group because the group doesn't have a lot of fun because you didn't spend the necessary amount of preparation getting ready for what was going to happen. Um, but when the person just calls it out so that they look, I don't know. I don't even know how you would term that, but so that you know, that they're the rock star and that they make you look bad. You, that is only hurting the other people at the table because you might have prepared a really interesting scenario, but the person calling it out at the very beginning before you even got into it has undermined the player's perception of what was going to happen, right? And it's just it is much more collaborative. And
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about this. The players, onus isn't on the game master to have a good session. It, he's the primary driving force behind it, but ultimately the players' contributions in tandem with the game master are what create those sessions where players walk away and they feel like they've contributed, that the game master, put a excellent situation in front of them, and that all around it was just everybody had a good time playing.
So I suppose what I'm edging towards was to ram us back on railroad us back onto track here would
Okay.
be the old the DM. You've made it to the entrance to a dungeon. As an adventurer, you're well within your rights to turn around and say, "Oh well, I'm actually going to go and chase these butterflies outside the dungeon instead, and see if I can level up my butterfly net skills."
Sure.
But at that point, you're not engaging with the story just to not engage with the story.
Correct.
And I think that's the line that you've got to find, and you're only going to find that through playing with your game master and your group in general more. So I would advise players against that in the early games, especially if you've got an inexperienced DM. If you're playing with someone like me or Greg, we're going to be fine. We'll deal with it and we'll work our asses off to try and make sure that the session becomes fun, whatever happens. But I don't think you want to push your friend who's decided to get the rest of you together to play your first ever D&D campaign. Kind of roll with the punches a little bit more.
Well, I
You'll
think
have
that's a good point, because I think from any player's perspective, the more you work with the game master, the more you collaborate with what they're trying to present you, the more successful you'll be as a player. The game master will feel like they're gonna want to reward players that are investing in their story,
yeah.
right? The the player that chooses to not invest in the story when you've done everything, when you feel like you've done everything in your power to give the players a reason, and the one of the players or a number of the players choose to just disregard that and go do something else, right? Like out of character. So I mean, they have a personal interest in what you're presenting them, but to spite you, then you're probably in the wrong group.
Yeah.
More so than anything else, right? Like that's not, over the long term. That's a group that is just going to blow up at the table,
Yeah.
right? So, and sometimes, people invest an awful lot of time in playing games and stuff like that. You're better, maybe. I would always say have a conversation, like, hey, what are we trying to achieve here? Because if this is what we're trying to do, then we need to like work together. But if the the table seems to be fractured, and yeah, then that might be a game that's just, you're I don't want to call it wasting your time, but ultimately you will, right? If you
Yeah.
invest 6 months into it and then the game blows up as you expected because of the way the players or the game master was behaving,
And it
then
comes back to what we're talking about, the prep as a game master. Uh, if you're gonna put in, like I said, me personally, if I've put in a lot of my time into establishing these arcs for the stories, and you just actively disregard them time and time again, wherever they're plonked in, and you just keep not engaging, at some point, I'm just gonna, I will have lost my buy into a game,
sure.
and it will just be
And that's an
the
important part too
yeah,
for any game master. When you're trying to get your players to buy in, don't leave them only one door. Leave them many different entrances to your story,
yeah,
because not every player and not every group is going to pick the obvious for whatever reason.
because it's never obvious. It's
Well,
obvious to you
sometimes
because you have all of the answers.
that's right. And so their reluctance, you have to judge that. Like, why are my players reluctant to engage with the story, right? You listen to them, and they're like, well, we were doing this or doing that, and we're worried that this is going to happen. Okay, well, so now you need to create a side door for your story, right? Where you can reintroduce the players back into what you were trying to get them to do, and and their fears are somewhat addressed, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's interesting because you're like, oh, it's like Colville's point of have the players at the beginning of the session tell you what happened last session, because their perception of how it went down and your perception will expose weaknesses or things that you
Yeah.
thought were pretty clear that they clearly didn't even notice, right? And so I
So
think that's collaborative again, which is what you're
I,
looking
I
for.
I understand the point of that advice, but I kind of disagree with it from a perspective of I get to like if I let you take tests to discover information and the entire party had that moment where, and it'll happen in every game, where they just roll ones for everything and never get it. It's time. That's a time where you can rephrase some information you presented, so you're not rewarding them for failure, but you can give them extra tidbits in your recap or clarify points where you saw confusion.
Yeah,
Where, and I think again, it can be how did you see this bit? You can get quite specific with it and address individual players. And when you can, because as a game master, and you're watching a lot of the time, and I think that's one of the great skills of a good game master is being able to observe the table whilst keeping the story flowing and the session flowing.
oh, that's crucial, I think.
Yeah,
Just
like you,
watching the players' faces
yeah,
to see when you drop something. Are
uh,
they like looking at their phone? Are they like, do you get the woo, right?
yeah,
Or, the reaction you get to it, or does that trigger, does the player madly start writing things down, right?
yeah,
Like they're obviously trying to figure something out. Yeah. So I
yeah.
think that's pretty important.
And having that knowledge, you can kind of realign your objectives with the party objectives at the start of the session and kind of give yourself a boost into where you want it to go. Whereas if you let the players recap, I think it's incorrect for you to then come in and say, well, no, that's not actually what happened.
Right.
Because
You want to collaborate with them. If
yeah,
there's something like, so, they say their piece, and then if they've omitted something, you remind them, but you do it in such a way that you're like, uh, do you remember running into this NPC? And what did they tell you? Oh
yeah,
yeah, right. Oh,
yeah,
this person talked about this and this and this, right? And yeah, and so yeah, absolutely. You want the players to launch off because for me, what you guys talk about is the things that you envision to be the most important. Because
yeah,
obviously you don't retell the story necessarily chronologically. You sometimes do, and
yeah,
that's obvious. If you're like, we started here and we went here and we saw this person, and so that's a chronological retelling, right? And you omit something, then that's fine, right? But if the players are all like, we finally got to this town and we, blah blah blah, and things happen.
what town did we finally get to?
Burnham Town.
Yeah, Castle Burnham. Yeah, Burnham's
That's right.
awesome.
That's
I'd
right.
remember that town.
Would you?
Yeah, the
Probably
sewers
because
are
it
awesome.
has. I was going to say because it has that sophisticated sewers from the ancient empire underneath.
Yeah, there you go. So we're getting about into an hour now, so I wanted to kind of move us on to some final points. So what I wanted to do was give some examples of like interesting meta plots or meta stories, or even not necessarily the overall ones, but uh, we'll go with that first because I don't want to muddy the water too much. But as a player or a DM, and obviously don't tell me this campaign, don't ruin it for me. But
Really?
yeah, but just a couple of interesting ones, even taken from modules you've played and stuff
Oh,
like
sure.
that.
I'll use an iconic one because this. I think if you're 50 40 years late to this, it's not a spoiler anymore. So if you're playing the old classic TSR modules where you start off in the Village of Hamlet and then you end up going to the Temple of Elemental Evil, right? So we did a very similar game, which was that one where I was talking about with the NPC. Well, they started in the Village of Hamlet, though I renamed it and changed a bunch of stuff. They went through the moat house and everything, and they ended up going to the temple. But they ran into a priest in the moat house that they weren't able to, like, she managed to escape. She escaped to the temple. She was the sort of reoccurring nemesis. And just as a side note, I won't go into too much, but clerics are terrible villains unless uh, unless you're using the Covillian method of just giving them a bunch of random abilities, right? Or not random, but just assigning them abilities that they can use. But if you're trying, any spellcaster is really tough to make as your super duper villain if you try to fit it within the framework of a class. But so they went through and they cleared out the whole temple and everything, right? They had a big sort of ending conflict with this priest, and then she had a scroll of recall and she recalled away, right? It was very frustrating for the players, and I was concerned about that because I was like, they really put in the footwork. Do they beat the villain here, or do I connect it to the next part of the story, right? So when they like rifled through, like she had to leave abruptly. They rifled through her belongings. They found her journal and a bunch of other notes, and then it led them to the next series of adventures. So at the time, I think we were running the Gs and like the giant modules, right? And that eventually you go through, you play through the hill giants and then the frost giants and then the fire giants, right? And this NPC kept fleeing with the leaders of the giants to the next stronghold, and then they finally get to the last giant module and they run into a bunch of dark elves, right? So the dark elves have been behind this whole operation from the very beginning. They were the boss of the giants. They were the boss of the temple. They were the boss of the cleric from the moat house, which the players ran into at like first level, right? So this has been going on in this background, this big story and everything. And then the dark elves flee through the tunnels into the D modules, and they end up in the big dark elf city, which eventually leads to you going fighting the demon queen of the spider webs. So this is a massive campaign, and really, it started off with Loth, and then the different families fighting amongst the dark elves, and this one family is trying to gain prestige by, taking over this part of the human lands and everything. And so as they play out the course of, let's say, 15 levels worth of adventure, this all sort of comes to fruition, right? You don't see it. I mean, by the time you run into the dark elves, you don't even realize that that's just one aspect of the sort of big story, that that this faction of dark elves isn't is one of many, and that the sort of big hand, the overreaching hand, is the demon princess, and she's pushing her agenda amongst the dark elves, and these guys are fighting back against her, and they've taken worshiping up a different god, and they were exiled. And there's just a big long, but I mean that's a classic, iconic.
Yeah.
Most older players have played those type of modules, and yeah, that is the classic meta plot, right? Where the players interacted with it and never realized when they ran into the cleric, they just assumed that the cleric was the boss of the big bears in the moat house,
Yeah.
right? And then the sort of she is the one that connects them to each step of the story, right? And then I think it was when they got to the dark elf thing in G3, they ended up defeating her. So she got killed, but at that point, her boss was there
Yeah.
that she'd been working for. And so now I just replaced that cleric with the next sort of villain, and then that villain took off again, right?
Yeah.
And then kept reappearing and reappearing and reappearing and reappearing, right? Yeah, and so that's that is the grand meta plot.
Yeah. So, in contrast to that, what do you think the idea is for a new game master? Because looking at 15 levels worth of storyline can be pretty intimidating to, because
Sure.
inevitably you end up trying to think of it when your characters are level 0 because they've not even been rolled up yet.
Yeah,
So
I wouldn't worry about
no,
it. So either when you're prepping your game, so like I'll use the current game we're playing in as an example. It came first.
yeah,
So the meta plot came to me, and then I felt like now I need to sort of build the regular story, and but it's even then. So your advice to the new game: make your first adventure.
yeah,
Decide on the boss at the end of your first adventure. Do you want that boss to lead them to the next adventure, or are you just going to let them wander around? So if you're gonna just have them hex crawl slash sandbox slash whatever, that first boss doesn't need to have any relevance, right? But
yeah,
if you want to start constructing a meta plot, that's the character that you start with.
yeah,
And you don't need to do anything. They just need to escape at the end,
yeah,
right? And then the players take off after them, in theory.
yeah,
The players like to chase things when they get outwit, like when they get outsmarted. So they take off after them and it leads them to the next story, right? And even then, you don't really need to know what's going on with this big sort of overarching story, right? Until the you it starts to come to you. You get the inspiration, and you're like, "Ooh, this would be kind of cool," and I'm going to put this in here and this in here, and then you're going to write these things, and you're going to put them down like Lego bricks. There's going to be huge gaps,
yeah,
and then you're going to slowly fill them in. And once this section is connected, then that becomes the like part of the story. And then you've got this section, and then you have to connect them, and then what you end up with a big section, and
yeah,
that's yeah. I wouldn't worry. I would absolutely not worry about having a meta plot when you start your game. Just see where it goes and see what characters the players connect with, like
yeah,
what NPCs the players really. Oh, I hate that guy. Okay, well, so the I hate that guy is the famous connection for wow, this dude would be awesome to have come back and again and again and again and
yeah,
again because they're just gonna hate him more.
yeah. So one idea I did have, I think I discussed it briefly the other night when we were at Denny's. Other late night restaurants are available unless Denny's want to sponsor us.
That's right.
Um, but well, I was talking about the concept of playing like self-contained adventures, and when I was thinking about this episode, I kind of modified that idea. But I think a good way of maybe approaching it, especially if you're really intimidated by this as a new DM and you're trying to plan something out, the idea of enclosed like scenarios or like campaigns where this campaign is going to run for like 6 sessions. That you've got these characters from level 5, you're going to take them through to level 7, and you can expose them to this storyline. It takes 6 sessions, and then you can take them in a completely different campaign, take them from level 1 through to level 5 with something else happening with different characters, then do a session with them from like level 10 to level 15, and then you can start tying it all together. So the characters don't know that they're in a big meta story, but the players who are at your table can start picking up that this stuff is happening in the world, and it gives you a lot more of a looser framework to play with, and you can start telling the stories. And then the players might be like, "Oh, I really wish we could go back and try that character," and you can collaborate and bring it around that way. And if you have an idea and it just isn't working, you've wasted 6 sessions. You can jump back in, and you can, if you've got players who aren't getting along, and I think that kind of approach might be a pretty interesting way to get into this grand storytelling that I think everyone wants a D&D campaign to be.
Sure, but more often than not, it ends up like Lost
Yes, and that's what.
because they struggle. They introduce aspects that are cool at the time with no explanation, and they're like, okay, at some point, I'm going to figure out why there's the polar bear in the jungle. I'm going to figure out, why the pirate ship is in the middle of the jungle. Yeah,
Yeah,
but they struggle to connect the dots, and it becomes glaringly apparent to their players that they were just attractions.
yeah. And I think a good point of that style of campaign, because you're just effectively ditching those characters after they've completed their mini quest, is you don't have to tie everything together. And I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but I think it does take a lot of the onus and a lot of the pressure off you if that is what's putting you off from becoming a game master. And I don't have why would they want to play my game? I don't have a story to tell. You can probably tell a short story.
Hmm.
You
It's
don't
easier
have,
to tackle. It's
yeah.
absolutely easier to tackle.
You're not writing a novel at this point. You're not writing book 7 of Game of Thrones. You're writing, chapter 1 of a pamphlet type thing, and
Well, the other key thing with, so you're just looking to, you've got your little area. You know, you either pick, this might be a topic for like a different episode, but you pick your setting, and let's say you do your own setting. So one of the kind of coolest things is when you play through your like little succession, and then the next players make their dudes. They interact with the characters from the previous campaign
yeah,
as NPCs,
yeah,
right? And at some point, if you come up with a plan to tie it all together, then go back to playing their characters, right? Then you sort of like, we've done the time jump, which is pretty classic, right? We've moved to where the game, that first games ended and it's advanced 2 years, and this is where you guys find yourself. You know, your dwarven fighter is now a blacksmith in this town.
yeah,
You know, that fits in with the interactions the second group has had with the NPCs. And yeah, I think that I I the I would be super reluctant to tackle the sort of massive, right? And even when you have this sort of like inkling of an idea, hey, this would be super cool. You know, when the players are 10th level, I want them to do this.
yeah,
You know, get a notebook and write it down, right? And then write all these things down and then see if you can find a way to connect them. And if you can't, don't force it. That's huge, right? Don't try to put all your cool elements that you've come up with into your story unless they're reasonable, because it's apparent that that's what's going on, right? And like I said, the best meta is the seamless meta that the players don't even realize that we've switched from camera 1 to camera 2.
yeah,
And then we go back to camera 1 and they don't even realize that anything has happened. But then later on, right, when it, the light bulb moment is pretty awesome for the game master, when he like looks across the table and something's going on, and that you can see the light bulb come on in the player, and they're like, the player just sort of got this sort of empty look, and then he says to the guys, remember like about 2 months ago when we were in this town and we were talking to that dude, and there some of them are like, yeah, yeah, or some of them remember, and he's like, yeah, well, what happens if that guy is working for the dude we're currently looking for? And we remember how we told him what our plans were, and we've wondered how up till now we seem to be behind the 8 ball. We're getting constantly foiled by our opposition. Well, maybe it had to do with the fact that 10 sessions ago you revealed to the agent of the sort of medium boss what your plans were.
yeah,
And then the players are all like, whoa, right? And you as the game master have had to do nothing. You just get to sit there and watch it.
yeah,
And and the and satisfaction with mission accomplished, like what you were trying to do. So the like sort of to wrap things up, the meta plot is a slow burn. It it can go sessions without ever rearing its ugly head, right? But when it does, it should be relevant
yeah,
and memorable, and then left alone to ferment, and then the players go on and do what they're doing, because long term the payoff will be way better, right, when the players look back in retrospect and see it all sort of fall into place and they're all like, oh, right.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a good place to end that. So I'll briefly remind everyone that they can win this grizzly bear, either the painted one or the sealed one. The grizzly bear. Is that better? Grizzly bear. Grizzly bear. I don't know.
Does it come in a
Bear.
mug?
Bear.
Does it come in a mug? Yeah. They serve it in pints.
um, so all you need to do is answer that question with the answer that we told you, and then if you email it to dicehate@gmail.com, you can, or info@dicehate.com. Either one of those emails will go to the same address anyway, and we'll pick a winner. I was also thinking that once we've got enough questions, we will do a listener question episode. So if you have any questions, make sure you send them to us at info@dicehate.com or dicehate@gmail.com. Either one of those emails. You can hit us up on Facebook. Just type it into one of the polls or one of the episodes where we share it in the comments on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. Tell us about your meta plots that have worked in your games, or just anything that you think. I mean, that's the great nature of the community, the internet, and so forth, is uh, your comment can fuel the imagination of someone that you have no relationship whatsoever,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's super important. Lots of stuff that I've just been poking around, and I read somebody's comment, and I was like, "Well, that was really cool. That was awesome. I would have never come up with that on my own."
You're all more than welcome to jump into a Dice 8 Discord as well. There should be a link in all of the, however format you've got this, should be a link to the Discord. You can come and chat to me and Greg in there, ask us questions in there. You can read all our complaints about Justin never turning up for our D&D game and ruining everything. Because I know Justin will listen, so there you go, burn, savage burn. And
Well snapped, Thanos.
do you have any ideas for topics for next week that we can put in the poll, or do you want to do Fireball against whatever that other loser topic was? I'm gonna have to check on which polls was it that we were lost. Fireball lost, or part it was alignment.
How about we not even just call it Fireball? How about we just talk about 5th edition spells?
Yeah, magic in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Or the intricacies of character alignment. Do you want to do that vote off, or did you want to? Do you touched on a new topic there? Did you want to throw that one in?
Yeah, I've forgotten already.
Okay, cool. So you were talking about setting up your game and the area you
choosing your setting.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we do whatever.
We could have a 3-way poll: choosing your setting, character alignment, or 5th edition magic.
That's right. How the game would be much better
if Greg got to rant about Fireball at everyone's table.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's everything. So thanks for watching, everyone. We really appreciate it. We've done pretty well. It's episode 3. We're building up a couple of viewers here and there. So thanks. Greg's determined to make for us to actually overtake my X-Wing podcast, which shouldn't be too hard, but it's on you guys to show that D&D is in fact better than Star Wars. So I'm not going to throw that challenge out there. Either way, it's fine. I like both. It's okay. Make sure you're subscribed to us on YouTube if you want to watch the VODs. If you want to catch the podcast version, it is available on a Dice 8 podcast, which is currently shared between the X-Wing podcast and this one. If you'd like it to have its own, you have to become a Patreon and give me more money because I can't afford that. So you can support us on Patreon if you like. And we'll probably do more giveaways through Patreon if you want to do it that way. Or maybe do like patrons get like double entries when they answer the questions. So I was thinking that I will do one of these giveaways every week if I can talk God into sponsoring us from a Sentry Box. Maybe
nice.
Do a painted miniature
We'll make
every time.
We'll make a random monster encounter table with your names on it, and then we'll do a random monster check, a random encounter check to determine our winner.
But what I was thinking is because we're currently playing in a D&D campaign, the iconic monster from the session, I can get that pack, paint one, and then we can either give away a sealed pack or the painted pack, depending on what they want to do. That's what I thought I could do. Let us know if you think that's a good idea. Comments, tell us you want free stuff, and it may well materialize. And yeah, don't know. I think that rounds us out at an hour and 15 minutes. So pretty good. Not too far overrunning again. Thanks for joining us, Greg. I appreciate the conversation as always.
Indeed.
And thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one.